Welcome everyone to today's Mishna Yomi. Today, Emirz Hashem, we will be learning Mesechas Demai, Perek Aleph, Mishnayis Gimel through Dalit. Chapter 1, Mishnayis 3 through 4, which interestingly enough, short Perek will be the end of the first chapter of Demai. So Mishnah Gimel says as follows, Halokeach lezera ulabehema. So remember again, what's interesting to note is as follows, that halacha lemaisa, if a person has produce which is untithed, that produce is called tevel. Untied produce. So the halacha is one is not permitted to eat tevel, and one is not really permitted to get general basic benefit from tevel. Using it to go ahead and fuel, using it to feed one's animals. So remember, kind of in line with what we learned in yesterday's Mishnah is, as much as the rabbis obligated us to retithe demai, at the end of the day, there are many leniencies associated with demai. So, for example, halokeach lezera ulabehema. Let's say a person goes ahead and purchases produce from an ama aretz, but they're not going ahead and purchasing it per se for their own personal consumption. Rather, I'm going ahead and using it to plant, or that's lezera, or lebehema, to feed my animals, or kemach la'oros. I'm going ahead and purchasing flour from an ama aretz for tanning purposes. Flour was one of the things that she used to use to go ahead and smooth out hides. Or shemen laner. I'm buying oil in order to use it as fuel for a lamp. Shemen lasach boas hakelim. Or I'm buying oil in order to go ahead and use it to smear utensils. In all of these cases, pater min demai. This produce that is purchased is not subject to the laws of demai. And again, the logic is because the laws of demai really only apply to something that was bought for consumption purposes. But in all of these circumstances, you're purchasing the produce for non-consumption purposes, and therefore, again, laws of demai don't apply. So the Mishnah discusses, in general, interestingly enough, the idea of Trumas and Maestros only applies halacha lemaisa to Eretz Yisrael. So because of that, throughout Shas we have different discussions regarding the borders of Eretz Yisrael. So here the Mishnah says, Michazivu lahalon paja min hadmai. If you went ahead and you purchased produce from the town of Kiziv and beyond that, this is on the northern side of Eretz Yisrael, ultimately, again, it is not subject to demai, and the reason is because the Bartanura explains that even though Kiziv and the area north of it was sanctified when Yehoshua came into Eretz Yisrael, it was not re-sanctified with the return of the Babylonian exiles in the time of the Second Temple era. So because of that, again, it doesn't have Kedushas Eretz Yisrael, it doesn't have the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael, and therefore its produce is not subject to Trumas and Maestros. And of course, if you're not subject to Trumas and Maestros, then there's no din of Demai as well. Chalas Ama Aretz. See, here's what's interesting. So we spoke about in yesterday's shir the idea that even Amei Ha'aretz, who we are concerned perhaps we're not as proficient or we're not as competent when it comes to the separation of Trumas and Maestros, are careful with certain things. For example, Truma Gedola, right? The separation of Truma which goes to the Kohanim. That we assume that even Amei Ha'aretz, in fact, go ahead and do. So along the same lines of that, the Mishnah explains that there are other things that Am Ha'aretz is careful with as well. For example, Chalas Am Ha'aretz. So ultimately, again, we could assume that halacha lemaisa, if a Kohen goes ahead and receives challah from an ama aretz, we could assume that the other appropriate tithes were taken. Meduma is a mixture of truma and chulin. V'halakuach bekesef meiser sheni, or produce that is purchased with meiser sheni money. Ushiyari minachos, or any leftover parts of a mincha, petur min admai. Ultimately, again, all of these items are pater from demai, because once again, because they all have a level of consecration, we assume that the Ama Aretz is careful with them. Shemen Arev, that is an interesting case. What about if a person goes ahead and purchases oil? But again, Shemen Arev is oil with a smell, with a fragrance. So one goes ahead and purchases this oil from Ama Aretz. Now the Bartanura says the case over here is, once again, a person is purchasing this oil for the use of smell, for aroma purposes, not using it to smear on their body, or not using it again as, obviously for consumption either. What's the halacha? Beis Shammai mechayv, and Beis Shammai says that still the laws of Demai apply to this oil. Beis Hillel potrin, and Beis Hillel says that halacha lemaisa, the oil is exempt from the laws of Demai. Now, again, interestingly enough, this is a more Yisulistic machlokes as to, remember, Beis Hillel is in line with the beginning of the Mishnah, because the beginning of the Mishnah said pretty much any produce that's bought from an Amaretz for non-consumption purposes is not subject to Demai. Therefore, again, if you buy fragrant oil from an Amaretz, it's not subject to Demai. Beis Shammai, on the other hand, hold that the obligation or the concept of Demai pretty much applies to any type of produce that you purchase from an Amaretz. Incredible. That's Mishnah Gimel. We now come to Mishnah Daled, Mishnah 4, Hademai. So now, there are certain things that you're allowed to do with Demai. So, for example, Hademai, Ma'arvin Bo, you can make an Eruv with Demai. So remember again, we know that Halacha L'maisa on Shabbos, you have 2,000 amas in which you're permitted to go ahead and travel in any one direction. You could extend that travel area by placing an Eruv. Right? The Eruv essentially establishes your domicile somewhere within your initial 2,000 amos and gives you an additional 2,000 amos. The halachic assumption is home is where your food is, and therefore, again, you could set up an additional domicile. So you could use Demai for an Eruv. Or Mishtatzvin Bo. Mishtatzvin Bo is what's called the Shita of Muvaos, which is if you have a bunch of courtyards which open up into a shared alleyway, all the respective courtyards have to join essentially in an Eruv together. We don't call that an Eruv, we call it a Shita of Muvaos, a partnership amongst the alleyways. Also requires collection of food from all of the various courtyards. So halacha l'maisa, you could use Demai food for that. Umavarchan alav. That is interesting. If you ate Demai, you make a bracha over it. Now, again, the chiddush, of course, in that is you're not allowed to eat Demai. Right? You're not allowed to eat Demai. But if you did eat Demai, or if you're going to eat Demai, regardless of the prohibition, you would still make a bracha. Umizamnin alav. And ultimately, again, you could be part of a mezumin if you ate Demai. So again, all of this really makes sense in light of the fact that at the end of the day, we actually believe that the Amaretz probably did, the statistical probabilities that the Amaretz did separate out the requisite Shumas and Maisros, but this is a Chumrah, this is a stringency. So therefore, again, as much as it's stringency, in certain areas we have the ability to be lenient when necessary. Umarfishin also arum. Now remember, again, we'll get into this, but when you purchase Demai from an Amaretz, what that requires of me is I have to separate out everything except Shumagidolos, after you separate out tithes. Now, normally when you separate out tithes, you make a bracha. With Demai, there is no bracha upon the separation of tithes. Therefore, technically speaking, one could even do it unclothed. In other words, since there's no bracha, I could separate out the additional tithes from Demai, even if I am unclothed. Similarly, Ben Hashmashos, you could also do it, Ben Hashmashos, in the twilight period right before Shabbos. Normally, you're not allowed to do tithing in the twilight period before Shabbos, but Demai, you're allowed to do so. Now, the Mishnah then goes on, and the Mishnah gets into halachas of vidui meiser. So remember again, we actually made reference to this at the end of Peah as well, which is as follows: that in the 4th and 7th years of the Shemitah cycle, one has to do what's called vidui meiser. One has to confess that he has distributed all of his tithes. Now, the halacha is that there's an order for the distribution of tithes, and if a person disrupts the order, they do not recite vidui meiser. So that's the topic of our Mishnah over here. So that would be true under normal circumstances. When it comes to Demai, see, im hikdim meiser sheni l'rishon in bekach klum. So for example, under normal circumstances, if you went ahead and separated out meiser sheni, which remember is the portion that I, the farmer, take to Yerushalayim and enjoy myself. I just have to go ahead and take it to Yerushalayim and eat it there. Meiser Rishon, on the other hand, this portion I give to the Levi. You're supposed to separate out first Meiser Rishon, then Meiser Sheni. If you messed up the order and you separated out Meiser Sheni first, so in a regular situation, that means you wouldn't do Vidui Meiser. You would not do the confession of the disbursement of the tithes. However, for Demai, even if you messed up the order, we still allow you to go ahead and recite the Meiser confession. Shemen agardi sach be'etzba'osav chai b'demai. This is interesting. So Gardi is a weaver. So sometimes, again, a weaver would put oil on his fingers as a form of protection. So he gets everything moves more smoothly off his fingers. He doesn't get cut. He doesn't get pricked. So halacha l'maisa, that oil ultimately is subject to Demai. Now that makes sense because remember, he's smearing it on his body. V'sha'sorek nosei b'tzemer. But again, if somebody who combs wool, he puts oil into the wool to make it easier to comb the wool, pater min Demai. ultimately, again, remember, this goes back to what we saw before in the previous Mishnah, that he would be pater from Demai. Because again, remember, the distinction is very simple. In the case, even though the weaver is putting it on his body, not for necessarily shmearing purposes or enjoyment purposes, but for work purposes, nevertheless, his kavanah is to smear it on his body. Because of that, ultimately, again, it is subject to Demai. But when you put it in the wool, in order to comb the wool, so there the kavanah is not to put anything on my body, the kavanah is for the wool. This goes back to Beis Hillel in the previous Mishnah, that halacha lamaisa, the Demai will not apply to anything that's either non-consumption or non-physical enjoyment. All right, we'll stop over here. Mazel tov on finishing the first parak of Demai. Wishing everyone a wonderful day.